The mission of the Pennsylvania Department of Education is to ensure that every learner has access to a world-class education system. Welcome to PDE Presents, a podcast series for lifelong learners that's dedicated to elevating voices across the Commonwealth. And now your host, Noe Ortega.
Welcome to PDE Presents. I'm your host, Noe Ortega. PDE Presents is part of a broader strategy by the Pennsylvania Department of Education aimed at changing the way that we think and talk about the mission and outcomes of education in the Commonwealth and across the country. Through this strategy, the department aims to shine a spotlight on the greater public good and collective mission of education. This podcast invites scholars, school leaders, educators, and other stakeholders to participate in conversations that unpack contemporary topics in education, with a focus on equity. My guest today is Sharif El-Mekki, the founder and CEO of the Center for Black Educator Development. The center exists to ensure there will be equity in the recruiting, training, hiring, and retention of quality educators that reflect the cultural backgrounds and share common socio-political interests of the students they serve. Prior to founding the center, El-Mekki served as a nationally recognized principal and U.S. Department of Education Principal Ambassador Fellow. His school, Mastery Charter Shoemaker, was recognized by President Obama and Oprah Winfrey and was awarded the prestigious EPIC Award for 3 consecutive years as being amongst the top 3 schools in the country for accelerating students' achievement levels. In 2014, El-Mekki founded the Fellowship, Black Male Educators for Social Justice, an organization dedicated to recruiting, retaining, and developing Black male teachers. El-Mekki blogs on Philly's 7th Ward, is a member of the 8 Black Hands podcast, and serves on several boards and committees focused on educational and racial justice. Welcome to PDE Presents, Sharif.
Thanks so much. It is great to be here, Secretary Ortega, and thank you for this platform that focuses on equity. It's really important.
Absolutely pleasure to have you, Sharif. For those who may be meeting you virtually for the first time, what is something that you might be willing to share with our listeners about who you are as a professional and how you approach the work?
Yeah, so this is my 26th year working. I had 26 years working inside of schools. So I'll start with that. I came in as a alternative certification teacher. I was on my way to law school and decided to teach. There was an alternative certification program looking to hire more Black men. And it was between the School District of Philadelphia, Cheney University, and Concerned Black Men, a national nonprofit. And once I got to Turner Middle School and I started teaching 8th graders social studies and literature, I never looked back. So I'm on now the 28th year where I've deferred law school, continue to defer it. But I really just appreciated, how education has allowed me to really fulfill what I thought I wanted to do in life, which was impact my community, bring some of the activist leanings that I had as a child and growing up, and supporting the community, particularly children and youth. So I'm really, just really grateful about that, and that has continued. My work as a teacher has continued to be on the front of my mind as I transitioned to a principal, and now as a CEO of a nonprofit.
Appreciate that. I also appreciate that your story begins. A funny thing happened on my way to becoming a lawyer.
Right.
You ended up in education.
Yeah, different type of lawyer joke, right?
Definitely. Well, Sharif, there's no doubt this past year has changed the educational landscape forever. What do you feel is one of the most pressing matters in the field of education?
Yeah, I think, 2 things. One, when we look at just school communities and what they meant for so many people, both, the students, the adults, whether they're family members, parents, or staff, that community that's, was just such a important part of people's lives when it was thriving. when there were struggles, it also showed like for some students it was almost a reprieve. But regardless of what the experience was, we have to recognize the interrupted learning that occurred. For some students, 12 or 13 months. And it doesn't mean that students weren't learning anything, but it definitely had an impact for a significant number of students. I think the other thing that really is challenging with this with the landscape is we have the pandemic on one side, but then you also have this endemic of institutional racism that also collides with that. So you have these two entities coming together that really significantly impact all of us, but particularly students of color, and Black students in particular, when they're seeing things like the situations and the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. But also, there are students in those communities. There are students who look at TV and say, wow, that looks like my parents or my neighbors. And what is the racial stress that impacts them, but also staff and teachers of color who have those same type of racial stress, even if it manifests itself a little bit differently than it would a child. And then you have large groups of educators trying to make sense of like, okay, what's the Monday morning question? How do we converse with our students? How do we converse with our staff? And what does this mean all in the context? So I would say, when we're talking about like the pressing matters, I think obviously the health and safety, but also, safety at a larger sense, like, not just the physical, but the emotional, the cultural, the intellectual, the spiritual safety of a child to be able to be fully present, to be their full selves. And what does that mean? How do we construct those type of communities? And I think a big part of that, as we're thinking about safety, it is also teacher preparation, elevating the profession through diversity, strengthening pathways for people to lead the classrooms, so that there's more parity in racial and cultural backgrounds between teachers and students and educators and students. So I think there's a lot going on, where there are always challenges, but I think if I had to lift up two things, it would one be the health and safety and returning and addressing interrupted learning loss and like, okay, how can we accelerate it? And acknowledging the racial stress that students and teachers of color, educators of color experience, and how do we elevate this profession as we try to reimagine what could a new system look like post-pandemic.
I appreciate that, Sharif. And I think, one of the things that's important that you bring up is here we are, right? On the cusp of a verdict being determined on the George Floyd case. Folks really thinking about the disrupted learning, but also needing to reconcile the other reality of what we're seeing play out around racial injustice as well. And I think these are two important things that educators, many of them who feel like they're not equipped, have to begin to reconcile, particularly when we're moving to in-person instruction. I think about your career, and I know that a lot of the conversations that you and I have around equity, in particular racial justice, and how that informs education and our interaction for educators. I wonder if you might share with our listeners how your equity lens informs and frames the way that you approach your work each and every day.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think when I, way back in 1993, when I was considering becoming a teacher, and I wanted to be a lawyer because I wanted to impact change. I wanted to reform. I wanted to be able to, fight for justice. And expose injustice, as my friend Michael Kort often says, is what happens when you go to a courtroom as a lawyer. But when Dr. Martin Ryder, Black man, veteran educator in the school district of Philadelphia, what he talked about was that educational justice and racial justice were deeply intertwined, and you could never really separate the two. And if you were addressing one, you had to automatically address the other if it was true, if it was going to really be, in pursuit of justice. And that really resonated with me over, over the span of my career, and definitely informs how we work at the Center for Black Educator Development. This idea of, equity, and what does it mean? How do students experience school? Not just the teaching, not just the learning, but how also do students of color in particular experience? How do uh, families and communities of color, how do they experience efforts to improve or accelerate student outcomes? Do they feel that they are part of it? When we look at uh, attrition rates, that there's a saying that teachers don't often quit their students or their school communities. They quit their principals, right? And so what does equity look like as far as principal development, and how effective are they in leading a school's, kind of maintaining a culture that's conducive for teaching and learning, developing a leadership team to support the entire school building, all of those things. And where are students of color, where are Black students, where are brown students attending schools? And if you looked at a map, is our is achievement, could you look at it and predict it based off of a zip code and the inhabitants of a zip code, right? Like, will they more likely to have the least experienced teachers, the the schools that are environmentally unsafe? Are those cities or districts underfunded, right? Like, you can sometimes look at these things and they become predictable. And for us, that is a matter of equity, first and foremost. How learner ready, so to speak, an educator is. How many accomplished educators do I have as a Black or brown child? All of those are equity issues for us, which means that they impede the path towards justice. And so for us, that is a big part, ensuring that our teachers are well, um, uh, just prepared and informed and reflective, and have the culture of humility and fluency to be able to work with students, to be able to see and hear the students that they serve. And those are some of the things that accelerate student achievement. But often our students of color do not have those, they do not have the accomplished teachers. They do not have teachers that look like them, or educators that look like them and understand them at a deeper level. And we know the impact that this has, both short term as well as long term, when students of color do not have educators, particularly teachers, who look like them and share, their backgrounds. And so, for us, that is a big part of our work. While we recruit Black and brown teachers, we provide professional learning opportunities for all educators. And for us, that is a really, really important piece.
And I appreciate that you share that perspective with our listeners, Sharif. I know since the time that you and I have been working together, you've always held the department and myself in both my roles as the Deputy Secretary for Higher Education and now as the Acting Secretary. You've held us accountable to ensure that educators are culturally responsive, that are using culturally relevant approaches to their work. And I know you've described learner ready, and you've always had that uh, uh, extra element of making sure that we understand the importance of the role that the educators play. And I think it's really coming out in how you share, the way that you frame your work. I wonder if you might also be able to share some of the things that your team are doing at the center to break down barriers and maybe even reconstruct systems with equity at the forefront. And if it's something that you've been working on for some time, or even something new in the pipeline, please feel free to share with our listeners.
Well, Secretary Ortega, one of these very well, because you've been leading this effort from early on, is the Aspiring to Educate initiative through the department, both as a deputy secretary with then Secretary Rivera, and then now as acting secretary. And I think this Aspiring to Educate initiative is really highlights and then just an important work to deconstruct some of the barriers that exist, to reimagine. And for the listeners, this Aspiring to Educate, I think two major things happen. One, it kind of really planted a flag of setting a goal, specific goal of increasing diversity by 20% by 2025 across the Commonwealth. So I think a lot of times states are, a little adverse to setting goals because they're nervous about failing. But what a goal does allow you to do, particularly a public goal, it allows to galvanize the sector to, have almost be a rallying cry for people to come together, because it is not just the Department of Ed who's responsible for this. There are a whole lot of stakeholders and constituents who can contribute to the success the same way that they contributed to the bricks inside of the walls that served as barriers. And so I think that's one, and I remember some of, the meetings that we had, whether they were in Harrisburg or whether they were in Omaha with other departments of eds across the country, and really trying to, address the issue. And I think, Pennsylvania's outlook to Aspiring to Educate was one of the more holistic and comprehensive efforts. I would say, with this Aspiring to Educate, the other part that it did is not only kind of be this clarion call about the issue, but it also galvanized a group of folks. So one of the applicants for the funding that came through Aspiring to Educate was around a consortium and bringing people together, bringing organizations and institutions together that unfortunately, maybe they were in same spaces before, but not around a singular issue, which is teacher diversity and elevating the profession, which I think this is what allowed us to do. And we are honored to be a part of that, as the center, both through the professional development work that we're doing with some of the IHE, some of the universities, across the state, as well as our teacher apprenticeship program, where we raise money to pay high school and college students who identify as Black and Brown to practice the art of teaching, to practice and interrogate the mindsets that they must have to be effective educators, to be able to work collaboratively with other high school and college students in an effort to have this clinical experience that directly impacts first, second, and third graders' literacy rates, their positive racial identity, their educational activism. And so for us, this Aspiring to Educate initiative has been just a tremendous, part of our work. And, we're grateful, honored, and excited to do this work in community. Like, as a teacher, I never felt like I was not in community with others doing the work. As a school leader, even though both of those roles may feel isolating, we found affinity spaces. We found, our village, our crew, our team, to work together on particular issues, whether it's individual student achievement or someone struggling or a colleague who needed help. And I feel the same way at the Center for Black Educator Development, that I feel that we are in community with others in trying to address some of the entrenched issues of equity and particularly around racial parity between educators and teachers specifically and students. So this is all very, very close to my heart, my life mission, and the center's work.
I think, Sharif, when you raised the idea of community, to me, that was one of the takeaways from the Aspiring to Educate work, because it simply went in there and elevated what was already happening in the community, right? In the Philadelphia community, with your center, the institutions of higher education, the schools that you had been a part of with the School District of Philadelphia, and everyone came together to sort of elevate. And to a certain extent, it eliminated the excuse that anyone would put out that if you don't have the critical mass of educators of color, then you could not embark on this path. And what this suggested was, no, you can tap into elements of the community where you could find the affinity groups to provide support for your educators of color and use that as a stepping stone. And I think that came through with your involvement and what you represented. So, on behalf of the department and myself, I thank you for that as well.
Thank you.
To be a part of that. Sharif, this work that we're doing, as we try to address some of these inequities, these racial injustices, educational injustices, as you've characterized them in our conversation, is not easy.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any advice on the strategies that you use that you might be willing to share with some of our listeners who are looking to follow in your footsteps on how you manage and cope with a lot of the stresses and anxieties that surround this work?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. And I think about this a lot, now and as well as over the past quarter century. I think it's a delicate balance of being humble and bold. I think the humility comes in with understanding like you can't do it alone. It's not going to change overnight. That you have to take care of yourself well in order to be able to serve others. That you have to be inquisitive and curious and really ask, solicit feedback, and listen and kind of really try to understand where other people are coming from, and just as importantly, how they are experiencing your leadership, how they are experiencing your work, right? Because we can often come in and like, if we have a lack of humility, we can think like, oh, we're here and we're going to fix this and we're going to address this and we're going to do this. But it's not in community with others. It's not looking at other perspectives. It's not in service to um, the community and the way that they want to be served, right? And so I think a big part of it is really asking, like, how do you experience my leadership? How do you experience my work? Is it as a partner, or what can I do better? What can I start, stop, or continue? And those are questions that I used to ask as a principal, as a teacher, and now I'm also asking in this space. And I think that's that we all can do that, and we can all be reminded about that. And then the other side is being bold, like, setting goals and seeking them and setting benchmarks and milestones to get to a particular goal. And I think being bold means that, Muhammad Ali used to say, hey, if your aspirations or your dreams don't scare you a little bit, go back to sleep and dream up something new, like, so you have to have that kind of boldness, because we have to recognize the depth of the problems, the challenges that our students face. And if anything, we should be ready to hand off the baton and things are better. And so that takes a boldness, and it takes action. It takes thought and action. And so I think combining those two things, where you have the humility, cultural humility, reflectiveness, curiosity, and I think that kind of servant leadership, and then also being bold and recognizing, like, we have to act with a sense of urgency. And a sense of urgency doesn't mean these don't have to conflict, right? Like, sometimes people act with a sense of urgency and they don't care who they run over to get there. But there are other ways to do that. There's an African proverb, like, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And I think this has been a theme of our conversation, whether it's Aspiring to Educate and the consortium, or, as educators, the goal is to go together, like get there together, to win together, to struggle for, on the path of, as we used to say back in the day, on the path of righteousness, that is done in community with others. And with that, we'll be able to go far.
I appreciate that, Sharif. And I think for me, it's clear that you've been able to fashion your profession to really become sort of a social justice advocate, right? And often we forget to talk about educators from that sense. And I think it's really going to be what will be introduced, I know, in our conversations, as a new way to characterize our educators as we move into a new century, right? Take on new issues and deal with a lot of the disruptions that we've seen, not just from the pandemic, but things that we've seen in terms of injustice play out. And so I really do appreciate that. I think our listeners are going to take away that you truly exemplify servant leadership in what you do. And I think in many ways, you continue to be sort of that legal advocate. So we really do appreciate the insight that you provided today. And I want to thank you for joining us today. And just let me personally add that this has been an absolute privilege to talk with you as well. And I look forward to continuing to work together, Sharif.
Secretary Ortega, thank you for inviting me onto this program, and appreciate your work and leadership, and looking forward to the continued collaboration on this path of equity.
Thank you. I'm Noe Ortega, and thank you to all who joined us today for PDE Presents.
Production and technical assistance provided by the Harrisburg branch of the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network.